Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm Ryan. Today I'm going to be refuting Diana's speech, which she states that juveniles should be properly punished as adults. Her three supporting points were that there are newer methods every year to commit certain crimes. The juvenile system is used to rehabilitate, but it does not work. It fails at its job. And when a child is being accused of a serious offense, they should be tried as an adult. So, in response to her saying that there are newer methods every year to commit serious crimes, I feel, one, that she needs to be more specific with the types of crimes that these children should be tried as adults, whether there's a certain age range that we get, but I believe that if you're going all the way up to 18, that's a pretty big range of development for these kids. So Diana mentions that approximately 30,000 out of 83,000 individuals released from custody committed a second crime post-release, but she did not mention the type of crime, whether it was the same severity as the previous type that they committed. So my question is, what if the 53,000 individuals that did not recommit crimes were the ones that committed violent crimes to begin with and did end up learning their lesson and benefit from these rehabilitation programs, and that the 30,000 that did commit a second crime were the ones that didn't hurt anybody in the first place nor the second? So SPLcenter.org states that if children are tried as adults for certain crimes, they may experience even more harmful environments in adult prison and therefore are more likely to commit a second crime upon release. So Diana's second point being that the juvenile system is used to rehabilitate, but it fails as such. My response is that punishment is a failed strategy at changing behavior to a positive way. As we know, an eye for an eye is probably not the best way to raise children. I mean, spanking a child more commonly now is viewed as probably not the best idea, just because it may further result in this child possibly spanking their children and promoting small acts of violence in their very own home. Children are far more likely to be assaulted in these adult prisons. CNN.com provided a little excerpt that it made me cringe reading it. In a little more severe pine bars, Patrick has witnessed more than 30 stabbings. He has learned some lessons, however. Failing to turn over his property when a prisoner demands it puts him at risk of being stabbed, as does refusing a sexual overture. This thought hangs over him constantly. So now, is this really what we want? What happens when these individuals are eventually released and attempts to live a normal life? They have to live every day trying to be better, but for so many years, they experience the very same behavior that they were punished for to begin with happen right in front of their eyes, and there's really no escape in that situation. Diana's last point is that when a child is being accused of a serious offense, they should be tried as an adult. Children and adults alike can tell the difference between right and wrong, but that doesn't always mean that their actions will reflect it. Just because a child is aware of what is right or what's wrong, and they still committed a heinous crime, it does not mean that they will be unaffected by rehabilitation programs. As we know, children do often act irrational. Let's say, for example, if a boy were to knock an ice cream out of a little girl's hand, the boy's going to get in trouble for the most part. He's aware of what he did, he's aware that it's wrong, and he never does it ever again. So most likely all it took was a little scolding from his parent, and he never committed the same behavior ever again. It didn't require physical punishment. So now obviously this isn't the same thing as committing a serious act of violence, but all physical behaviors do stem from some act of hurting someone, or something in this case. And the lesson was learned and further prevented. Another interesting point that I found was that youth tried in adult court can be given sentences of life without parole and consequently are put last in line for rehabilitation programs. So if we're saying that we should have a child be tried as an adult, what determines whether they qualify for rehabilitation programs? CNN.com actually provided an incident with a 9-year-old named Cameron Kocher, and it was determined that he would be tried as an adult because during his pretrial motions, he was dozing off and appeared to show a lack of remorse. The judge then determined that this was normal behavior, or that the child was too normal to benefit from any rehabilitation programs. So let me repeat that. The child was too normal to receive rehabilitation. so he was furthermore tried as an adult. So, in conclusion, I believe that with this particular issue, you do need to be more specific with the types of crimes or even the age range of these children that should be tried as adults. Second, that punishment is a failed strategy in changing behavior for a positive way. And lastly, that children and adults, though alike, they can tell the difference between right and wrong, their actions may not always reflect it. Thank you.
All right, well, you identified the advocate's main and secondary claims very clearly. The signpost on the first point was fine. You challenged the lack of specificity in the advocate's range of what they're talking about. What are we really discussing? How young are the children that we're dealing with? How old? What kinds of crimes are we talking about? And I think that there's a good basis here to suggest that there are plenty of crimes that don't ever deserve to be treated as adults, even though they might be serious crimes because of the nature of kids and because of the ability to potentially rehabilitate. But that the advocate doesn't specify, and as a consequence, you've got a sweeping generalization here that's problematic. I think that's basically the argument that you're trying to make here. You kind of create a hypothetical out of her statistical information about the recidivism rate. You say, well, what if the other 53,000 were the ones that actually were? Well, that's an interesting question. You don't have any reason to believe that any more than she has any reason to believe the other. I think that there is a likelihood that there's going to be recidivism here. I think your argument ought to be that younger people are more likely to respond to rehabilitation efforts, and that I don't know that any of the data that she cited is about juveniles. And when she's talking about those 80,000 people who were released, none of it seems to specify that they were juveniles in the first place. So you're talking about the general prison population, and you're trying to equivocate that behavior to a different population, and that's it's one of the fallacies. And it's not jumping into my head at this instant. It'll come in just a second. And so I think that's a legitimate criticism that you've got there. The signpost on the second point is also clear. You make a general argument about how punishment is not necessarily the best way to address these issues. There's an assertion about spanking and it having some particular problem. Like I said, that's all inserted. There's no evidence on that particular point. You've got an example of a child who's exposed to some horrific things in the prison. I think that that's definitely one of the reasons why you want to point out that there are problems having kids in prison, because it hardens them, it changes them, and if there is a chance, Gesundheit, if there is a chance of fixing a problem here, prison is not the place that you're going to be able to fix that problem. I think that's the argument that you really want to be making there, and your evidence sort of makes that point, but you need to make a clearer statement that that is the argument that's going on there. And then the third point, you basically kind of summarize some of the issues that the advocate's presenting. You've got this hypothetical example of the kid with the ice cream, and we got to teach them a lesson, but we don't have to beat them in order to teach them that sort of lesson. I think one of the things that you want to point out is that there's an absence of evidence in the advocate's claim on a lot of the points that is specific, that without knowing the particulars of a particular case, it's hard to make those certain kinds of judgments. We have general rules that regulate this, and I think you ought to be making a defense of what those general rules are. The vast majority of juveniles are not charged as adults for a reason. The ones that are charged as adults, there's usually a reason why they were charged as adults, and the idea that we shouldn't have a distinguishing characteristic is problematic, because there are good reasons for that. And I think that's the way that argument needs to be summarized a little bit more. The system works the way it does for particular reasons. And judges and prosecutors have a variety of discretion for a purpose. You know, they look at kids and they say, here's somebody that maybe we can save. Here's somebody that we could fix if we don't treat them as an adult, we give them an opportunity here. On the other hand, here's somebody that's a real problem that nothing is going to take care of, and we have to protect society from that particular person. The idea that we shouldn't distinguish between those two, I think, is problematic, and that's where I think you want to make that argument a little bit stronger. All right, thank you.